Maya Brooks never imagined a routine trip to the store would end in handcuffs. A seasoned Homeland Security agent, she found herself arrested by a cop with no clue who she was or what she was capable of. But as she sat in the back of that police car, calm and composed, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about her. It was about a system that had let men like him operate unchecked for too long. And when the truth came out, no one would see it coming. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Maya's mornings were sacred. There was something about the quiet hum of the world waking up that gave her peace. She cherished the stillness before the whirlwind of her day took over. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that felt refreshing against her skin as she stepped out of her house. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves, mingling with the early hints of chimney smoke from the houses nearby. She inhaled deeply, savoring the moment before sliding into her car. Maya had been working with Homeland Security for 10 years. Her career was something she had poured her heart and soul into, pushing through barriers that, at times, seemed insurmountable. Being a black woman in a field dominated by white men wasn't easy, but she had long since stopped allowing those challenges to weigh her down. She had fought hard for her position, and her reputation was solid. She was known for her keen instincts and the calm demeanor that never wavered, even in the most stressful situations. Today was a day like any other, or so it seemed. She had a few errands to run before her shift, the kind of mundane, everyday tasks that helped her disconnect from the intensity of her job. A quick stop at the grocery store for some essentials, followed by a trip to the pharmacy. Nothing out of the ordinary. Maya appreciated these moments of simplicity. They reminded her that despite the chaos of her profession, there was a world outside of it, an ordinary, quiet world where she could just be Maya. As she drove through the tree-lined streets of her suburban neighborhood, she found her mind wandering to the state of the world. Racial tensions were at an all-time high, and the news seemed to be filled with stories of police violence, protests, and deep-seated inequalities. Maya wasn't immune to these issues. She had lived them. But they were starting to weigh on her in ways they hadn't before. Despite her success, despite her professional demeanor, she still faced prejudice, even in the most unexpected places. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. Today wasn't the day to focus on that. She had errands to run and work to do. Her job required her to stay sharp, and she couldn't afford to be distracted. As she turned the corner, the familiar sight of the grocery store came into view. But just as she was about to pull into the parking lot, something caught her eye in the rearview mirror. Flashing red and blue lights. Her heart skipped a beat. Confused, she glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding, and she hadn't run any stop signs. Why was she being pulled over? With a sigh, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, watching the police car come to a stop behind her. The officer who stepped out of the patrol car was tall, with broad shoulders and a square jaw that seemed permanently set in a frown. His uniform was neatly pressed, and his walk was measured and deliberate. He approached her car with an air of authority that made Maya instantly wary. There was something in his eyes, a coldness, a quiet hostility, that sent a chill down her spine. She rolled down her window and placed her hands on the steering wheel, just as she had been taught to do. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone curt and devoid of any warmth. His name badge read Collins, but he didn't offer any further introduction or explanation. Maya kept her voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I said license and registration," he repeated, ignoring her question. Maya nodded, keeping her movements slow and deliberate as she reached into her glove compartment for the documents. She handed them over, and Collins snatched them without so much as a glance in her direction. He turned and walked back to his patrol car, leaving her sitting in uneasy silence. Something was off. She had been through traffic stops before, but this felt different. There was an intensity in Collins' demeanor that made her uncomfortable. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard as the minutes ticked by. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. What was taking so long? Maya shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. She wasn't nervous. Exactly, she had done nothing wrong, but there was a growing sense of unease gnawing at the back of her mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Collins returned. But instead of handing her documents back and sending her on her way, he motioned for her to step out of the car. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone flat and unyielding. Maya's brows furrowed in confusion. "What's this about?" "Step out of the vehicle now," he repeated, his voice growing more insistent. Maya hesitated, her mind racing. She had been trained for situations like this. As part of her job, she knew exactly how to handle herself during encounters with law enforcement. But this situation didn't feel like any she had been in before. Collins wasn't giving her any explanation, and his tone was growing more aggressive by the second. Still, she kept her composure. There was no need to escalate the situation. She had nothing to hide. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Her eyes locked on Collins as he approached her. "Turn around, place your hands on the hood," he ordered, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. A wave of disbelief washed over Maya. "Officer, I don't understand. What's going on?" "Do as I say," he barked, taking a step closer. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but outwardly she remained calm. She had faced far worse situations in her line of work. She wasn't about to let this officer intimidate her. Slowly, she turned around and placed her hands on the hood of the car, feeling the cold metal beneath her palms. Collins roughly patted her down, his movements brusque and unkind. Maya could feel the disdain radiating from him, could sense the judgment in every touch. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Was this about her car? Her appearance? She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the tension in the air was thick with something unspoken. Once Collins was satisfied, he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "You're under arrest." Maya blinked, her stomach dropping. "On what charges?" "You'll find out soon enough," Collins replied, a smug smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Maya's mind reeled. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. This was a misunderstanding. No, it was more than that. It was something far more insidious. But now wasn't the time to argue. She would play along for now, knowing that the truth would come out soon enough. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Maya felt an odd sense of calm settle over her. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something much bigger was at play here, and she was prepared for it. For now, all she had to do was wait. The real fight was just beginning. Officer Collins stood by his patrol car, watching as Maya, calm and composed, sat in the back seat of the police cruiser. His jaw clenched as he stared at her through the rearview mirror. She didn't seem rattled. Most people in her position would be nervous, maybe even panicked, but not Maya. There was something about her that irritated him, something that made his blood simmer just beneath the surface. Collins wasn't sure why he had pulled her over in the first place. Something about her car, the way she had been driving so confidently, had made him suspicious. She didn't look like the kind of person who should be driving a car like that in a neighborhood like this. And her demeanor, so sure of herself, was grating. It didn't help that he'd had a rough morning. He'd been arguing with his wife again over the same old things, and it left him feeling more agitated than usual. But this was different. There was something about this woman that made his skin crawl, and he couldn't put his finger on it. His mind was racing, his heart pounding, as if there was some kind of unspoken threat emanating from her presence. He knew she hadn't done anything wrong, at least nothing that he could prove, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Collins had been a police officer for almost 15 years. He was known for being tough, a little rough around the edges, but effective. He had grown up in a rough part of town and had seen enough crime to believe that you couldn't trust anyone, especially people who didn't fit into certain neighborhoods. His experiences had shaped his worldview, made him cynical, and fostered a level of suspicion that bordered on paranoia. He didn't believe in coincidences. If someone looked like they didn't belong, there was usually a reason. He stood there, taking deep breaths, trying to calm himself down. The truth was, he was under a lot of pressure. His job wasn't what it used to be. The department had been scrutinized lately due to several high-profile incidents involving officers who had overstepped their bounds. The public was angry, and there were talks of reform, of cutting back police power. It felt like the whole world was against him and his fellow officers. They were supposed to protect the community, but now they were the ones under attack. And Collins? He had felt the heat directly. Just 2 months ago, he had been suspended for a week after an incident where he had used force on a suspect during an arrest. He believed the suspect had been resisting, but the video that surfaced online told a different story. That suspension had humiliated him, and his reputation had taken a hit within the department. Since then, he had been walking on eggshells, afraid of making another mistake that might end his career for good. So when he saw Maya, her confidence, her car, the way she didn't seem to fear him, it triggered something inside of him. He wasn't going to let her make him feel small. He wasn't going to let anyone undermine his authority again. As he walked back to the patrol car, his mind raced. He had already called for backup, but he still didn't have a solid reason for arresting her. The department was already on edge, and he knew he needed to tread carefully. But a part of him didn't care. This was about control, about asserting his dominance over a situation that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He needed to show her and the world that he wasn't afraid to take charge, even if it meant bending the rules a little. As he opened the door to the cruiser, he met Maya's steady gaze. Her eyes were calm, almost serene, as if she knew something he didn't. It unnerved him. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice measured but firm. "Like I said, you'll find out soon enough," he muttered, refusing to meet her gaze. He didn't have an answer, and he didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing that. Maya didn't say anything else. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. Collins hated it. He hated that she wasn't scared, that she wasn't begging him to let her go. It made him feel powerless, and that was something he couldn't tolerate. He slammed the door shut and walked back to his squad car, where he sat for a moment, trying to figure out his next move. He knew he was in over his head, but admitting that was out of the question. Instead, he radioed in a vague report of a suspicious individual and requested further instructions. As he waited for a response, his thoughts drifted back to the arguments with his wife. Things had been falling apart at home for months. She had become distant, tired of his long hours and constant anger. They fought about everything: money, time, his obsession with work. She accused him of bringing his stress home and taking it out on her and the kids, and maybe she was right. But Collins didn't know how to stop. The job was everything to him, the only thing that made sense in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. Now, with his personal life crumbling and his professional life hanging by a thread, he felt trapped. And Maya, with her quiet confidence, was a reminder of everything he had lost. She didn't need to raise her voice or fight back. Her very existence felt like a challenge to him. "Officer Collins, come in." The crackle of the radio snapped him out of his thoughts. He grabbed the receiver, his voice tight. "Collins here." "What's your status on the suspect?" the voice on the other end asked. Collins hesitated. "Still questioning her," he lied. "Waiting on backup." "Understood. Proceed with caution. There's been a lot of scrutiny lately. Make sure you have a valid reason for detainment." Collins's jaw tightened. Copy that. He knew the warning was a veiled threat. The department couldn't afford another scandal, especially not after what had happened last time. But Collins wasn't thinking about the department. He wasn't thinking about protocol or the potential consequences. All he could think about was the fact that Maya was sitting in the back of his car, calm and composed, while his life felt like it was spiraling out of control. He was tired of feeling powerless, tired of being questioned and second-guessed. And in that moment, Maya became the symbol of everything he was fighting against: his failing marriage, his shaky career, and the sense that the world was slipping away from him. Without waiting for backup, Collins marched back to the cruiser. He opened the door and roughly pulled Maya out, his grip tight on her arm. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he muttered under his breath as he led her toward the station. "You think you're better than me?" Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes, and it only fueled the fire burning inside Collins. As they arrived at the station, the weight of what he had done began to settle in. This was no ordinary arrest, and deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. But it was too late to turn back now. He had made his move, and there was no undoing it. But as Collins led Maya through the station doors, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was about to face consequences far greater than he had ever imagined. Maya sat in the cold, gray holding cell, her wrists still sore from the handcuffs that had been unceremoniously snapped onto her earlier. The steel bench beneath her was uncomfortable, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the room. Despite the physical discomfort, Maya's mind remained calm and sharp. She had been in worse situations before, though never as the subject of an arrest. This was unfamiliar territory, but Maya knew how to navigate it. She had spent her career studying patterns of behavior, knowing when to speak up and when to remain silent. For now, silence was her greatest tool. She could hear the murmur of voices in the distance, the low hum of officers speaking just out of earshot. She imagined Officer Collins among them, his voice probably louder than the others, trying to justify what he had done. But Maya knew the truth. Collins was unraveling. She had seen it in his eyes, the barely contained rage, the confusion masked by false bravado. Men like him, who believed their authority was beyond question, often acted impulsively when they felt it slipping away. Still, Maya was acutely aware that the situation could turn in any direction. Her background in Homeland Security had prepared her for countless contingencies, but being wrongfully arrested wasn't one of them. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, and she allowed herself a small breath of reassurance. She hadn't revealed her identity yet. There was still time. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. A moment later, the door to the holding area swung open, and a senior officer stepped inside. His face was stern, but there was an unmistakable air of curiosity behind his professional demeanor. He paused before her cell, looking down at Maya as if assessing the situation. "Miss Brooks, I presume?" His tone was formal but laced with concern. Maya didn't move from where she sat. "That's correct." The officer, whose name tag read St. Daniels, nodded slowly. "I'm going to need to ask you some questions about the circumstances surrounding your arrest. Officer Collins seems convinced you were acting suspiciously, but his report is lacking in details." Maya gave a small, humorless smile. "I'm sure it is." Daniels glanced at her, noting her calm demeanor. He had been on the force for a long time, and in his experience, people in holding cells were rarely this composed, especially not when they believed they were wrongfully arrested. Something wasn't adding up. He pulled a chair over and sat down across from her. "Let's start from the beginning. Can you tell me what happened?" Maya folded her hands in her lap and maintained eye contact with Daniels. "I was pulled over by Officer Collins for reasons that were never explained to me. He asked for my license and registration, and when I complied, he detained me without providing any valid cause. After that, I was arrested." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Did he indicate why he believed you needed to be taken into custody?" Maya shook her head. "No. He mentioned something about finding out soon enough, but he never gave a legitimate reason." Daniel's face tightened. "I see. And during this process, did you offer any resistance?" Maya's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "I'm a federal agent, Sergeant Daniels. I've been trained to de-escalate situations, not to provoke them." The words landed like a weight in the air between them. For a moment, there was complete silence. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, his brain processing what he had just heard. "Federal agent?" Daniels repeated, his voice quieter now, more cautious. "What agency?" "Homeland Security," Maya replied, her tone still calm. She reached into her jacket pocket, which had been returned to her upon entering the station, and produced her identification. She held it up for Daniels to see. Daniels took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. He stared at the ID in front of him, then back at Maya. His mind raced with the implications. A Homeland Security agent arrested on a routine traffic stop? The fallout from this would be enormous. I had no idea," Daniels stammered, his professional mask slipping for a moment. "Officer Collins didn't mention anything about your credentials." Maya raised an eyebrow. "That's because he didn't bother to ask." Daniels rubbed a hand across his forehead, visibly shaken. This wasn't just a minor misunderstanding. It was a monumental error, one that could have serious consequences for the entire department. He stood up quickly, almost knocking over the chair in his haste. "Miss Brooks, I'm going to need a moment. Please sit tight. His voice was hurried, but respectful. Maya watched him leave the room, her calm expression never wavering. She had known that revealing her identity would have an impact, but even she hadn't anticipated the full scope of what was to come. As Daniel stormed down the hallway, his mind was racing. He had to find Collins. He needed answers, immediately. When he reached the station's bullpen, he found Collins sitting at his desk, hunched over paperwork, with a look of irritation plastered across his face. Daniels didn't waste any time. "Collins!" he barked, causing the younger officer to look up in surprise. "What?" Collins muttered, his tone defensive. Daniels loomed over him, his voice low but charged with barely contained anger. "Did you know you arrested a Homeland Security agent?" Collins's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Miss Brooks, the woman you dragged into this station without cause. She's a federal agent, Collins. You didn't even check her credentials?" Collins opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind was spinning, grasping for some kind of explanation that might justify his actions. But there was none. He had been so blinded by his own assumptions, his own biases, that he had never considered the possibility that Maya Brooks was someone far beyond his control. Daniels leaned in closer. "This is going to blow up in your face, Collins. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Collins swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he clutched the edge of the desk. He had thought he was in control of the situation, but now the rug had been pulled out from under him. Everything was falling apart, and there was no way to stop it. I didn't know," Collins stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniels straightened up, his face grim. "Ignorance isn't going to save you. You need to fix this, now." But even as Daniels walked away, Collins knew it was too late. There was no fixing this. The damage had been done, and now he would have to face the consequences. Back in the holding cell, Maya waited. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the tension building in the walls around her. She knew Collins was likely scrambling to cover his tracks, but it wouldn't matter. The truth was out now, and the wheels of justice were already in motion. The door to the holding area opened once again, and Daniels stepped back in, this time with a far more respectful demeanor. "Miss Brooks, we're releasing you immediately. I deeply apologize for the mistake, and I assure you we'll be conducting a full investigation into Officer Collins' actions." Maya stood up, adjusting her jacket as she prepared to leave. She nodded at Daniels, her expression still calm, but there was a fire in her eyes now, a quiet, determined flame that couldn't be extinguished. "I trust that you will," Maya said, her voice measured. "Because this isn't just about me, it's about the way people in this country are treated based on the color of their skin or the assumptions others make about them. And I won't let this slide." Daniels nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and relief. "We'll make sure justice is served." As Maya walked out of the station, the crisp autumn air hit her face once again. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what had just transpired settle on her shoulders. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The fight for justice was only beginning. The moment Maya stepped out of the police station, a flood of emotions hit her like a wave she hadn't anticipated. The fresh autumn air, so crisp and cool against her skin, provided little comfort now. Despite the victory of being released and revealing the truth about her identity, there was a heaviness that hung over her, a burden not easily shaken. She knew that what had just happened wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger, deeply rooted problem, and it wasn't going to be solved with one wrongful arrest being corrected. As she made her way to her car, her mind buzzed with conflicting thoughts. She knew she had to report this, to follow through on the investigation of Officer Collins and the police department. But as much as she prided herself on being strong and composed, the experience had left a scar. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she sat there for a moment, taking in what had just unfolded. The public would soon hear about this. It was inevitable. Maya wasn't just any citizen. She was a federal agent, and that meant the media would pick up on her story the second it hit the internal channels. But Maya wasn't interested in being a headline. She wanted change, real change, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been wrongfully targeted, profiled, or discriminated against. As she drove away from the station, her thoughts drifted back to her childhood, to the many instances when she had felt this same sense of injustice. Her father had been a civil rights activist, a man who had taught her the value of standing tall in the face of adversity. He had faced his own battles, some of them far more public and dangerous than hers, but he had never backed down. Maya had learned from him the importance of resilience, the strength of remaining calm under pressure, and the power of using one's voice to fight back. She had always known that the world wasn't fair, that racism and prejudice were still very much alive despite the progress society claimed to have made. But the arrest had hit closer to home than she had anticipated. It wasn't just about being treated unfairly, it was about being dehumanized, reduced to a set of assumptions that had nothing to do with who she truly was. As she pulled into her driveway, Maya exhaled slowly. Her home was her sanctuary, a place where she could reflect and recharge. But today, the walls felt thinner, the security of her space less certain. She sat in the car for a few moments longer, staring at the familiar windows and door that had always welcomed her. But something about the day's events had shifted her perspective. The idea of home felt less concrete when the outside world could so easily reach in and disrupt her sense of peace. Before she could dwell too much on the day's events, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. "Andrew? DHS Director." Maya sighed. She had known this call was coming. "Maya, it's Andrew," came the familiar voice when she answered. "I just got word about what happened. Are you all right?" Maya took a deep breath. "I'm fine, physically, but there's a lot more to this than just me being pulled over." Andrew was quiet for a moment, likely digesting the weight of her words. "I'm sure there is. The department is already opening an investigation into Officer Collins. This isn't something we can brush under the rug." "I'm not looking for anyone to brush it under the rug," Maya replied, her tone sharper than she had intended. "I want this to be more than just a disciplinary action against one cop. We need to address why this keeps happening, why it's always people like me, black, successful, driving a nice car, who get pulled over for no reason. Collins didn't just arrest me because he was having a bad day. He arrested me because he couldn't stand the idea that someone who looked like me could be driving through that neighborhood." Andrew exhaled on the other end of the line. "I hear you, Maya. Trust me, I do. And you know I'll back you up on this. But we have to tread carefully. This situation could get complicated fast, especially once the media gets involved." Maya closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the seat. "I know. I've thought about that." She didn't need to see the news to know that her story would be spun in 100 different directions. Some would paint her as the victim of systemic racism, while others would question her actions, trying to twist the narrative into something that justified Collins' behavior. She had seen it happen too many times before, but this time she was determined to stay ahead of it. "I'm going to speak out," she said after a moment of silence. "I'm not going to let this slide, Andrew. If we don't make noise about this, nothing will change." Andrew's voice softened. "I expected nothing less from you. But be careful, Maya. The media can be brutal, especially when it comes to cases like this. You'll be under a microscope." Maya chuckled bitterly. "I've been under a microscope my whole life, Andrew. This is nothing new." They exchanged a few more words before ending the call, and as Maya finally stepped out of her car and walked toward her front door, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. But she was used to carrying that weight. It had been with her since she was a child, watching her father march for justice, knowing that one day she would have to fight the same battles in her own way. Across town, Officer Collins sat at his kitchen table, a cold beer in his hand. He stared at the bottle, barely aware of the TV buzzing in the background. His wife had left for her sister's house hours ago, taking the kids with her. She hadn't said much, just that she needed space, whatever that meant. Collins knew it wasn't about needing space, it was about what he had become. He took a long swig of the beer, letting the bitterness wash over him. His mind raced with everything that had happened at the station. The look on Sergeant Daniel's face when he had stormed into the bullpen, the words "Homeland Security agent" echoing in his mind like a death knell. He hadn't known. How could he have known? But deep down, Collins knew the truth. It wasn't about whether Maya Brooks was a federal agent. It was about how he had seen her from the moment he laid eyes on her. He had made assumptions. He had profiled her. And now it was all coming crashing down around him. Collins stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. He had been so sure of himself, so sure that he had been doing the right thing. But now, he couldn't even look at himself in the mirror without feeling disgusted. His career, his reputation, it was all at risk. He had been warned before about crossing the line, but this time was different. This time, there was no going back. As he sat there, wallowing in the mess he had created, the doorbell rang. Collins groaned, setting the beer down and dragging himself to the door. When he opened it, he found two men in suits standing on his porch. "Officer Collins?" One of them asked, flashing a badge. "We're from Internal Affairs. We need to speak with you about the incident involving Miss Brooks." Collins's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but seeing the agents on his doorstep made it all too real. "Yeah," he muttered, stepping aside to let them in. "I figured you'd show up." The men walked inside, their expressions grim. Collins closed the door behind them, knowing that this was just the beginning of what would likely be a long and painful investigation. Back at her house, Maya sat in front of her computer, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she composed an email to her colleagues. She knew that going public with her story would bring attention she hadn't asked for, but it was necessary. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless other people who didn't have the platform or the voice to speak out. As she typed, her words came quickly, each sentence a carefully crafted call for accountability, for change. She wasn't just going to let this incident pass without making it known that things needed to be different, not just in her city but everywhere. When she finished the email, she read it over once more before hitting send. There was no turning back now. Maya sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of her decision. She had chosen to take this fight head-on, just as her father had done all those years ago. And like him, she knew there would be pushback, resistance, and even backlash. But Maya Brooks was nothing if not resilient. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees. Maya watched through the window as the first hints of a storm began to roll in. It was fitting, she thought. A storm was coming, and she was ready to face it. The storm that had been brewing inside Maya's heart since the arrest was now mirrored in the weather outside. The sky had turned a brooding shade of gray, and the wind whipped through the trees, rattling the windows of her house. Maya stood by the kitchen window, watching the first drops of rain splatter against the glass. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of anticipation, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up and saw a notification that the media had begun reporting on her story. It was only a matter of time before her name was on every major news outlet across the country. She had anticipated this, but the reality of seeing her face and name associated with the headlines still unsettled her. Homeland Security agent wrongfully arrested, racial profiling, or a simple mistake, the headline read. Maya sighed as she scrolled through the article. The media, as expected, had already begun framing the narrative in various ways. Some were sympathetic, highlighting her professional achievements and the obvious misconduct by Officer Collins. Others were more cautious, suggesting that perhaps there were details yet to emerge. Maya knew that some outlets would twist the story, searching for any angle that might paint her in a less favorable light. That was just how these things went, but she wasn't interested in playing their game. This wasn't about headlines or public sympathy, it was about justice and accountability. As the rain intensified, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from her lawyer, Anita Green, a civil rights attorney who had taken on several high-profile cases involving police misconduct. Maya had reached out to her almost immediately after the arrest, knowing that she needed someone in her corner who understood both the legal system and the complexities of racial profiling. "Maya," Anita's voice was calm but urgent. "I've just seen the news reports. It's going to get ugly before it gets better." "I figured," Maya replied, pacing the kitchen. "How bad is it?" "They're already trying to dig into your background. You know how it goes, looking for anything that could make you seem less credible, less innocent. But you've got nothing to hide." We just need to stay ahead of it. Maya nodded, though Anita couldn't see her. I'm not worried about what they'll find. I've spent my entire career making sure my record is clean. I've got nothing to fear. That's true, Anita agreed. But that doesn't mean they won't try to spin something. Right now, the public is on your side. We need to make sure we keep it that way. Maya's jaw tightened. This isn't about public opinion. This is about making sure that Officer Collins and people like him are held accountable. I'm not interested in playing the media game, Anita. I know you're not, Anita said gently, but we have to be smart about this. The investigation into Collins is going to uncover a lot, and when it does, the department is going to do everything in its power to distance itself from him. They'll make him the scapegoat, and you might get some justice for yourself. But if we want real change, if we want this to be about more than just one officer, we have to keep the pressure on. Maya leaned against the counter, feeling the weight of Anita's words. She knew the attorney was right. This wasn't just about her personal experience. This was about a broken system, one that had allowed Collins to act the way he had without fear of consequence. And if she didn't keep fighting, nothing would change. What's our next move? Maya asked, her voice steady with resolve. We'll keep pushing for the internal investigation to be made public, Anita replied. If we can get access to Collins' full record, I'm willing to bet this isn't the first time he's crossed a line. Once we have that, we can start building a case for systemic reform within the department. Maya nodded again, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Let's do it, whatever it takes. After hanging up the phone, Maya stood in the quiet of her kitchen, staring out at the storm. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches, but the roots held firm. And like those trees, Maya knew she had to remain grounded, no matter how fierce the storm became. Across town, Officer Collins sat in a dimly lit bar, nursing a drink. The normally bustling place was nearly empty, save for a few other patrons scattered around the room. The news of his suspension had spread quickly, and now it felt like everyone was watching him, waiting for him to fall. He had tried to avoid the news reports, but they were everywhere, on the TV in the corner of the bar, on his phone, even in the whispers of the few people who still acknowledged him. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of his actions. The internal affairs investigation had begun almost immediately after Maya's release. Collins had been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome, but he knew what that meant. It was only a matter of time before they found enough to ruin him. He had been reckless, letting his biases and anger cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price. As he took another sip of his drink, the door to the bar swung open, and two familiar faces walked in. Sergeant Daniels and Lieutenant Harris, both of whom had been overseeing the investigation. They spotted Collins almost immediately and walked over to him, their expressions grim. "Collins," Daniels said as they reached his table. "We need to talk." Collins didn't look up. "I figured you'd come find me eventually." Lieutenant Harris pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, while Daniels remained standing, his arms crossed. "The investigation is turning up a lot of things, Collins," Harris said, his voice measured but firm. "Not just about the arrest of Maya Brooks, but about your conduct over the past few years. There are complaints, multiple ones, that were never fully addressed. It looks like those are going to be revisited now." Collins felt his stomach churn. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words out loud made it all too real. "Complaints?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. "From who?" "Other citizens," Daniels replied. "It seems Maya Brooks wasn't the first person you've pulled over for suspicious activity without any real cause. We've got records of stops involving people of color, all of which ended with similar outcomes: unjustified searches, detentions, and even a few that escalated into physical confrontations." Collins's face turned pale. Those weren't like this. Those people were." "Save it," Harris cut him off. "We're not here to hear your excuses. The point is, this investigation isn't just about the Brooks arrest anymore. It's about your entire career, and it doesn't look good." Collins leaned back in his chair, staring at the bottle in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. "So what happens now?" "You'll face a formal hearing with the department," Daniels said. "Depending on the outcome, you could be dismissed from the force. There's also a chance you'll face legal action if the Brooks family decides to press charges. Collins didn't respond. He had spent years building his career, convincing himself that he was making a difference, that his actions were justified. But now, it was all crumbling around him. And the worst part was, deep down, he knew that this wasn't just bad luck or a misunderstanding. He had let his biases and anger dictate his actions, and now he was paying the price for it. As Daniels and Harris stood to leave, Collins spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I'm a bad person?" Daniels paused, looking down at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "I think you made some bad choices, Collins, and now you're going to have to live with the consequences." With that they left, leaving Collins alone with his thoughts. Days turned into weeks, and the story of Maya's arrest continued to dominate the news cycle. As more details of Officer Collins' past misconduct came to light, public outrage grew. The city's police department was under intense scrutiny, with activists and community leaders calling for widespread reforms. Protests erupted outside the department's headquarters, demanding justice not only for Maya, but for all those who had been wronged by Collins and officers like him. Maya, meanwhile, remained resolute. She had become a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice, but she didn't let the media attention distract her from her goal. She worked closely with Anita Green to push for systemic changes, advocating for new policies that would hold officers accountable for their actions and prevent future incidents of racial profiling. As the investigation into Collins' conduct concluded, the department announced his official dismissal from the force. It wasn't just about the arrest of Maya Brooks anymore. It was about years of unchecked behavior, years of prejudice and discrimination that had finally come to light. The city's leadership, feeling the pressure from the public, promised to implement new training programs and oversight mechanisms to ensure that no officer could abuse their power in the way Collins had. But for Maya, the victory was bittersweet. While she was glad to see Collins held accountable, she knew that the fight was far from over. The system that had allowed someone like him to thrive was still very much in place, and it would take more than a single investigation to dismantle it. One evening, weeks after the scandal had first broken, Maya found herself walking through the same neighborhood where she had been arrested. The leaves had turned golden, and the crisp autumn air was tinged with the smell of wood smoke. She stopped at the corner where Officer Collins had pulled her over that fateful day, her heart steady as she looked around. It was strange to be back here, but Maya felt a sense of closure. The storm had come and gone, but she had remained standing, stronger perhaps than she had been before. And as she stood there watching the sun dip below the horizon, she knew that her work was only beginning. There would always be more battles to fight, more people to stand up for. But Maya Brooks was ready. She had faced injustice head-on, and now she was determined to keep pushing for a world where people weren't judged by the color of their skin or the assumptions others made about them. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves at her feet. Maya smiled faintly and turned to walk back home. The road ahead was long, but she wasn't walking it alone. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.